A lone man braved a treacherous, unfrozen wilderness and stumbled upon a wolf caught in a cruel wire trap. He risked everything to free the majestic animal, never expecting the wolf's next act to leave him and the entire world astonished. Could this harrowing rescue spark a bond that defies nature itself? In a remote corner of a vast wintry landscape, where snowdrifts tower over silent pine trees and the wind howls like a restless spirit, a man named Rowan set out on what he intended to be a routine hike for firewood. The season's first blizzard had swept across the land, transforming familiar trails into icy labyrinths. Armed with a sturdy coat, worn boots, and a heart steeled by years of living in the harsh northern frontier, Rowan thought he understood the hazards of the wilderness. But fate had a surprise waiting for him that frigid afternoon. As he navigated through a narrow pass, Rowan sensed something amiss, a faint whimper carried by the gale. Following the pitiful sound, he discovered a sight both tragic and alarming. A wolf, half buried in snow, ensnared by a makeshift wire snare. Its breaths came in ragged plumes of vapor, limbs trembling against the unrelenting cold. At first, Rowan hesitated. Wolves were fierce predators, known for their strength and cunning. Approaching one in distress was dangerous, especially with the sharp wire biting into its flesh. Yet, the wolf's eyes, clouded by exhaustion and pain, pleaded for mercy beyond any instinctive threat. Steeling himself, Rowan crept closer. He saw how the rusted wire had tightened around the wolf's leg, cutting into fur and flesh. Each twitch the wolf made threatened to sever its own limb or worsen the brutal wound. Heart-pounding, Rowan wrestled with a decision that might cost him dearly. Attempt to rescue and risk the wolf's desperate reaction, or walk away and let nature take its cruel course. In that tense standoff between fear and compassion, Rowan made his choice, one that would thrust him into a saga of bravery, loyalty, and an outcome that would defy all expectations. Little did he know, the next steps he took toward the trapped wolf would forge an extraordinary connection between man and beast, a connection strong enough to echo through the howling wilderness and beyond. And as Rowan bent down in the swirling snow to free the wounded animal, neither man nor wolf could foresee the astonishing turn their story would soon take. Despite the blistering wind that cut through his coat, Rowan knelt at the wolf's side, heart thundering. The animal's grey fur was crusted with ice, and flecks of blood stained the snow around its trapped leg. Even in its weakened state, a low growl rumbled in the wolf's throat. Rowan paused, breath pluming in the frigid air. One wrong move and the wolf could lash out, driven by pain and panic. But if Rowan hesitated too long, the creature would surely perish from exposure or its injuries. Summoning courage, Rowan pulled a small hunting knife from his belt. "Easy there," he murmured, voice trembling with both cold and anxiety. The wolf's ears flicked, golden eyes flickering with a mixture of fear and defiance. Then, as if sensing Rowan's intent was not to harm, the wolf quieted slightly, shivering uncontrollably. Rowan carefully pressed the knife to the wire, grimacing at the tension it held. Each small movement risked biting deeper into the wolf's leg. With painstaking slowness, he began to saw through the metal, praying the wolf wouldn't jerk in pain. Every moment felt like a lifetime. The howling wind carried away Rowan's labored breathing and the wolf's soft whimpers. Finally, with a harsh snap, the wire gave way. Free, but far from safe, the wolf collapsed onto the snow, too weak to stand. Blood trickled from where the snare had cut into its flesh. Rowan stared, heart heavy with pity. He realized that leaving the wolf behind would be its death sentence. Though conventional wisdom warned never to handle an injured predator, Rowan's conscience allowed no alternative. He rummaged through his pack, producing a rudimentary first aid kit. Hands shaking, he did his best to clean the wound, ignoring the wolf's low growl of pain. Slipping off his thick outer jacket, Rowan fashioned a makeshift sling for the wolf's leg. He had no illusions about taming a wild animal, but at least he could try to stop the bleeding and stave off frostbite. Looking around, he knew he had to move soon. The storm gathered strength, and shelter was a mile back through treacherous terrain. With careful effort, he hoisted the wolf into his arms. The beast was lighter than expected, testament to starvation and dehydration. Each step threatened to tip Rowan off balance, but adrenaline and empathy drove him forward. The journey back to Rowan's modest cabin tested every ounce of his endurance. Snowdrifts reached up to his thighs, and icy gusts pelted his face. Several times, the wolf stirred, snapping its jaws in fearful reflex, but Rowan managed to keep a firm yet gentle hold, quietly murmuring encouragement. By the time he spotted the faint glow of his cabin's window, his limbs ached with exhaustion, and the wolf's ragged breaths told him it was just as close to collapse. Fumbling with the latch, Rowan pushed the cabin door open. A gust of warm air greeted them, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. Carefully laying the wolf on a worn blanket near the fireplace, Rowan set about rekindling the hearth's dying embers. As the flames leapt to life, he stripped off his snow-laden clothes and retrieved clean rags to wipe frost from the wolf's fur. The creature quivered in renewed pain, yet allowed Rowan's ministrations, perhaps recognizing that this man was its only hope. For the next hour, Rowan alternated between tending the wolf's wound and melting snow for fresh water. He crushed a small portion of jerky into a warm broth, coaxing the wolf to sip if it could. Now illuminated by flickering firelight, Rowan took in the full scope of the wolf's condition. Every rib distinct, matted fur, eyes dulled by hunger and shock. Any second, the wolf's survival seemed to hang by a thread. And yet, a spark persisted in the animal's gaze, as if refusing to surrender to the cruelty it had endured. When at last Rowan allowed himself to rest, he sank into a creaky chair, breathing heavily. The wolf slept fitfully on the blanket, chest heaving. Outside, the storm raged, wind rattling the cabin's shutters. Rowan understood that he'd crossed an invisible threshold. Inviting a wounded wolf into his personal refuge was an act that bucked both primal fear and practical caution. If the animal recovered, would it be grateful or revert to its wild instincts? If it died, would Rowan forever question whether his heroic effort had only prolonged its suffering? Yet, looking at the pitiful creature's battered form, he felt a fierce sense of responsibility. He recalled the moment their eyes met at the wire trap. In that silent, wind-blown scene, he had glimpsed a plea, a primal cry for help from one living soul to another. And so, as the fire crackled and shadows danced on the log walls, Rowan made a silent vow. He would do everything possible to save the wolf, come what may. Outside, the blizzard howled, oblivious to the moral drama unfolding within the cabin. Little did Rowan suspect that this single act of compassion, risking life and limb to save a dying predator, would unlock a bond beyond the realm of normal human-wildlife encounters. For in his decision to shoulder the wolf's fate, Rowan had stepped onto a path that would lead to an outcome so astonishing that neither man nor beast would ever be the same. Rowan woke to a muffled whimper echoing inside the cabin. For a moment, he lay disoriented on his makeshift cot, unsure if the sound came from within a dream or the real world. A faint glow from the dying embers in the fireplace revealed the wolf, still curled on the thick blanket he'd provided, its chest heaving in ragged breaths. Although Rowan had done his best to clean the wound caused by the snare, infection was a looming risk. The wolf's panting reminded him that saving this creature would require more than a single act of kindness. It would demand ongoing commitment and, quite possibly, help beyond his rustic cabin. Summoning resolve, he rose and knelt beside the wolf. Its eyes fluttered open at his approach, revealing a flicker of recognition. Rowan gently laid a hand on its flank, mindful not to startle the half-wild, half-desperate being. "Hey," he murmured, voice thick with sleep. "Easy now. Let me see how you're doing." The wolf neither growled nor recoiled, an unspoken truce between them, fragile as frost under the morning sun. Despite the progress of having survived the night, the wolf's condition remained precarious. When Rowan gently peeled back the makeshift bandage, fresh blood oozed from the wound. He worried that he lacked the medical expertise, or even the supplies, to treat such a deep laceration properly. A trip to the nearest veterinarian would require an hours-long drive through snowbound roads. The battered pickup he owned was functional enough for hauling firewood, but the journey was fraught with risk. The wolf might panic or turn on him in a confined space. Yet if Rowan delayed, infection could claim the animal's life. He decided to try a small measure of trust. Digging into a trunk he kept by the fireplace, Rowan retrieved a battered rucksack filled with basic medical items. Among them were antiseptic wipes, antibiotic ointment, and clean gauze. Pitifully inadequate for a crisis this grave, but better than nothing. Approaching the wolf with slow, deliberate movements, Rowan dabbed antiseptic around the wound, muttering apologies whenever the wolf flinched. He half expected snapping jaws, but the wolf only whimpered softly, allowing Rowan's touch. It was as though the wolf recognized Rowan's goodwill, choosing to accept help rather than lash out in pain. Outside, dawn broke over a landscape drowned in white. The blizzard had subsided, leaving a pristine expanse of snow across the horizon. Rowan's cabin, a lone outpost in this frozen wilderness, felt both shelter and prison. With the wolf in such fragile shape, moving it across miles of treacherous terrain seemed impossible. Yet, staying put left them vulnerable to further complications, like predators drawn by the wolf's scent or storms that could cut off access to crucial supplies. Torn between these options, Rowan prepared for an arduous trip. Loading his truck with blankets, extra wood, and a small stash of food, he gently coaxed the wolf onto a makeshift sled contraption he'd once fashioned for hauling logs. Though the wolf trembled, it remained docile under Rowan's care, a telling sign of how close it was to surrender. Rowan couldn't help recalling stories his grandfather told about early trappers who, upon rescuing injured wolves, occasionally forged unbreakable bonds that defied typical predator-prey dynamics. Were those tales just romantic folklore, or did they hold a kernel of truth about wolves' capacity for gratitude? Securing the sled to the back of his truck, Rowan placed the wolf with as much care as possible, tucking blankets around its body. He whispered a soft reassurance, even though each breath of the wolf sounded labored. Then, with a heart pounding from a mixture of fear and purpose, he set off into the sweeping drifts. The engine groaned in protest as the truck navigated a narrow path, the windshield wipers fighting swirling ice crystals. Windshields half frozen, Rowan peered into white nothingness. Each yard gained a victory against the elements. After a grueling hour, he reached a broader road that led toward the small town of Ashwood. It was a place of no more than a few hundred souls, known primarily for its logging outposts and a handful of shops serving the scattered homesteads. The local veterinarian, a kind but overworked woman named Dr. Braxton, agreed to see the wolf on an emergency basis. Rowan carried the half-conscious animal inside, breath hitching at how limp it felt in his arms. Dr. Braxton worked swiftly, disinfecting the wound with practiced efficiency, injecting antibiotics to stave off sepsis. "It's touch and go," she warned, her brow knit with concern. "He's starved, dehydrated, and the wire did serious damage. Even if he pulls through, the leg might never be the same." The weight of her words hung in the sterile air. Rowan, exhausted and chilled to the bone, leaned against the clinic's wall. He couldn't bear the thought that this noble creature, one he'd risked so much to save, might still succumb. To Rowan's relief, the vet allowed the wolf to remain overnight for observation. She recommended sedation to keep the animal calm and minimize the risk of it hurting itself or staff. Rowan offered to pay what he could, though his funds were meager at best. Dr. Braxton only nodded, acknowledging the realities of rural economics. "We'll work something out," she said gently, letting Rowan know that compassion often overshadowed monetary concerns in emergencies like this. Stepping back into the cold twilight, Rowan inhaled a tremulous breath. He'd done all he could, for now. As he trudged to his truck, he felt a nagging question echo within. If the wolf survived, then what? Returning it to the wild, crippled and possibly reliant on human aid, might lead to a slow death. Keeping it near, taming what was inherently wild, posed moral and practical complexities. And yet he recalled the moment in the cabin, those fleeting seconds when their eyes met and a silent bond formed. Something about that connection felt bigger than logic or survival instincts, something that whispered they were meant to cross paths at this exact juncture. On the ride home, the swirling snow caught his headlights, creating a tunnel of ghostly flakes. Rowan felt a renewed sense of responsibility pressing against his chest. Saving the wolf from the wire trap had been just the beginning of an unpredictable path, one that might demand more faith, sacrifice, and courage than he'd ever known he possessed. Yet, he couldn't deny the pull of that mysterious bond. If the wolf lived, he would be there. If the wolf passed, he would honor its spirit, knowing at least it felt kindness in its final days. As Rowan's truck rumbled back into the outskirts of his homestead, a hush fell over the frozen landscape. The rescue had pivoted from a desperate act of mercy to a commitment that bound man and wolf in ways neither had foreseen. Unbeknownst to Rowan, the wolf's remarkable endurance, combined with the seed of trust growing between them, would soon ignite an astonishing chapter in both their stories, where the line between savior and saved blurred, and the wild heart of a wolf would stand side by side with human compassion, defying all expectations. Rowan had spent 2 restless nights back at his cabin, nerves on edge as he awaited any word about the wolf's condition. He'd left the animal, still sedated and fighting infection, in Dr. Braxton's care, trusting that if anyone could pull it through, it was her. Yet each gust of cold wind rattling the cabin's shutters seemed to whisper of the wolf's tenuous hold on life. Stoking the fire in his cramped living space, he replayed their every encounter, the wire snare biting into that frostbitten leg, the terrified eyes locked on his as he freed the wolf from certain death. An inexplicable longing swelled in him, a longing to ensure this creature's story wouldn't end in tragedy. Finally, just after noon on the second day, his phone buzzed with a call. Dr. Braxton's voice, steadier than he'd feared, carried cautious optimism. "He's stabilizing," she said, sounding both relieved and awed. "I still can't believe he survived the drive here in that condition, but your quick action helped. Antibiotics are taking hold, and his temperature is normalizing. He's not out of the woods, but there's hope." That same afternoon, Rowan drove his battered pickup through drifts of crusted snow to reach the small veterinary clinic on the outskirts of Ashwood. The place was humble, a low-slung building with a single row of windows and a hand-painted sign depicting a paw print. Inside, the fluorescent lights revealed a waiting room with scuffed floor tiles and walls lined with pictures of dogs, cats, and the occasional exotic pet. A faint antiseptic tang hung in the air. As Rowan entered, Dr. Braxton greeted him with a warm, if weary, smile. "He's in the back," she said, gesturing for him to follow down a narrow hallway. Passing rows of kennels, Rowan's gaze flickered over convalescing animals, an elderly spaniel with matted fur, a limping beagle recovering from surgery. Near the end of the hall, a sturdy metal enclosure held the wolf. Rowan's heart quickened at the sight. Bandages wrapped the animal's injured leg, and an IV drip delivered fluids to a battered body. Even so, something in the wolf's posture, ears half perked, eyes alert, signaled a will to fight on. Stepping closer, Rowan crouched beside the kennel door. The wolf eyed him warily but didn't recoil. Dr. Braxton nodded approvingly. "He seems to recognize you. Could be that memory of you saving him is stronger than fear." The idea that a wild predator might remember him with gratitude struck Rowan with quiet wonder. Then came the twist, one that made Rowan's blood run cold. Dr. Braxton hesitated, drawing in a breath. "I need to show you something," she said, flipping open a folder of documents she'd compiled. She pointed to a photograph of a different wolf. Same grayish-white coat, same scar above the brow, recovered by local rangers 6 months ago, found snared in an illegal trap. "He's not the first of his pack we've treated," she explained, eyes grave. "There have been repeated incidents of wolf snaring in this region. Usually, we only find the remains, but the pattern suggests a group systematically targeting these wolves, possibly to sell parts on the black market, or for some twisted trophy hunting. This one, your wolf, might be the last known member of a dwindling pack." Rowan's stomach tightened. The wire trap he'd discovered was no random leftover from a careless trapper. It was part of a deliberate campaign. And the fact that the wolf had survived at all was a minor miracle. Why was all he could muster, voice laced with anger and a stab of despair. Why kill them if not for dogfights or something? Dr. Braxton shrugged sadly. "Some do it for illegal trade, fur, bones, or just out of misguided hate for predators. It's a cruel practice that thrives in the shadows." In that moment, Rowan realized the gravity of what he'd stumbled into. Rescuing the wolf wasn't merely saving a single animal. It was entangling him in a broader conflict between those who revered the wild and those who exploited or feared it. Worse yet, If the people behind these snares learned Rowan had intervened, they might come seeking retribution or attempt to claim their kill. The more he thought about it, the more his sense of righteous anger kindled. He wouldn't stand by while such cruelty went unchecked. The wolf, oblivious to the conversation, let out a quiet whine. Rowan turned back, heart softening. Gently, he reached a hand to the kennel's mesh. The wolf, after a tense moment, pressed its muzzle close and inhaling Rowan's scent. An electric hush settled in the antiseptic-scented room. It felt like an acceptance, a vow that, despite belonging to separate worlds, they shared a bond forged in survival. Doctor. Braxton touched Rowan's shoulder, breaking the moment. If he continues improving, you can take him home to recuperate soon, but he'll need a calm environment and follow-up checks. Normally, for a wild wolf, I'd suggest a sanctuary or wildlife rehab center. But given how he responds to you and the circumstances, she trailed off, knowing well the complexities. Rehabilitating a wolf to the wild was fraught with risk, especially if poachers actively hunted his pack. At the same time, confining him to a human environment seemed almost a betrayal of his essence. Wrestling with these dilemmas, Rowan left the clinic under a dusk sky painted in shades of lavender and ash. The drive back was somber, headlights carving a path through the swirling snow. On one hand, relief washed through him at the wolf's stabilizing condition. On the other, the knowledge of a targeted wolf pack weighed heavily, hinting that saving this one animal would not be enough to stem the cruelty festering in these woods. If the group behind these snares continued unchecked, how many more tragedies would unfold? Pulling up to his cabin, Rowan killed the engine and sat there a moment, brow furrowed as the cold seeped through the truck's rattling frame. He closed his eyes, picturing the wolf's haunted gaze, remembering the wire trap's cruel bite. Something within him had awakened, a fire lit by injustice. Though a solitary man by nature, Rowan felt compelled to do more. If a clandestine ring was destroying wolves for profit or sport, exposing it might be the only way to truly protect the creature he'd fought so hard to save. Stepping inside, he poked at the embers in the fireplace, stirring fresh flames to life. The cabin's warmth felt hollow without the wolf lying near the hearth. Absently, he prepared a simple meal of bread and soup, though appetite eluded him. Tomorrow, he decided, he would reach out beyond his usual solitude, perhaps contact local rangers or an activist group. The father who once taught him to respect nature's balance had passed on long ago, but Rowan could almost hear that paternal voice urging him to stand for what was right. If ancient forces bound him and the wolf together, then maybe it was time he shouldered the role of protector, no matter the cost. The following morning, Rowan awoke before daybreak, head still spinning from what Dr. Braxton had revealed. Over a pot of coffee, he contemplated the wolf's uncertain future and the implications of an active poaching ring systematically targeting wolves. The knowledge weighed heavily on him, a moral burden that wouldn't allow him to return to his quiet, insular routine. He couldn't just patch the wolf up and release it to face the same dangers all over again. After downing a scalding cup, he grabbed his coat and headed out. The sky, awash in pale pre-dawn light, illuminated the snowy expanse. Icy air stung his cheeks, but he pressed on determined. His first stop, a small ranger station located on the edge of the nearest wildlife reserve. The structure, a squat, weathered building, served as a hub for the few rangers patrolling these vast territories. Rowan had rarely visited, preferring to navigate the forest on his own, but now he felt compelled to seek their expertise. Inside, the station was unremarkable. A linoleum floor, a few desks laden with maps and wildlife reports. He approached the counter, where a tired-eyed ranger named Sorensen greeted him. Sorensen listened in guarded silence as Rowan recounted finding the wolf ensnared in a wire trap and Dr. Braxton's suspicion about a wider operation. The ranger's stoic demeanor stiffened. "We've had a rash of poaching incidents, yes, but haven't pinned down the culprits. If what you say is true, that they're specifically targeting wolves, this is bigger than typical opportunistic hunting." Rowan nodded, relief flickering in his gaze. Finally, someone with authority acknowledged the gravity of the situation. Yet Sorensen also voiced hard truths. "We're stretched thin. Without solid evidence tying individuals to illegal snares, we can't build a case." Photographs, tag numbers, license plates, something concrete could trigger an investigation. The ranger rubbed his temples, looking genuinely troubled. If you come across anything, footprints, hidden traps, references to a name, document it carefully. Sorensen's words hung heavy. Rowan had no illusions about the perils of investigating a secretive ring on his own, but the conversation sparked an idea. Perhaps, if he meticulously tracked any signs of these operations, they could piece together enough proof to shut it down. Leaving the station, Rowan returned to Dr. Braxton's clinic to check on the wolf. The place was quieter than before. Inside the exam room, he found the wolf lying on a pile of straw in a larger enclosure, with its injured leg rebandaged. "Doctor." Braxton stood by, offering him a small smile. "He's improving more quickly than I expected," she noted, a hint of awe in her voice. "You might say he's got a strong will to live." The wolf's eyes rested on Rowan, still guarded but lacking the raw terror of their first encounter. Over the next hour, Dr. Braxton walked Rowan through post-operative care, how to clean the wound, administer antibiotics, and watch for signs of infection. When she broached the subject of long-term arrangements, a pained hesitation crossed Rowan's face. "I can't just set him loose in the wild while those poachers or whatever they are remain active," he admitted. "But keeping a wild wolf in my cabin forever isn't exactly sensible either." The vet nodded sympathetically. "Maybe you can foster him until we find a suitable rehabilitation center or sanctuary. The key is to ensure his rehabilitation doesn't leave him vulnerable, whether to poachers or to inability to fend for himself." Taking a steadying breath, Rowan agreed. "I owe him that much," he said simply. A pang of uncertainty gnawed at him, though he had never asked for this responsibility, this role as an unwitting guardian, yet fate had thrust it upon him. If the wolf could recover under Rowan's watchful care, perhaps they could buy time to help expose the illegal ring. He left the clinic, the wolf temporarily remaining under Dr. Braxton's supervision until it stabilized enough for transport. Back at his cabin that afternoon, Rowan methodically prepared for the wolf's eventual return. He cleared a corner near the fireplace, laying down fresh blankets and set aside food supplies. He even constructed a simple partition, both for the wolf's comfort and, if necessary, to protect himself during those times the animal might revert to raw instinct. As he hammered planks into place, he felt a mix of trepidation and purpose. He was carving out a space not just in his home, but in his life. Meanwhile, on his phone, messages from Ranger Sorensen and Dr. Braxton alerted him to sightings and tips around the region. A few local hikers had stumbled upon additional wire snares. Some believed they spotted furtive figures hauling supplies across remote trails. Each snippet of information sent Rowan's mind racing with questions. Were these the same people who'd set the trap that almost claimed the wolf's life? How vast was their operation, and how ruthless were they? These concerns weighed heavily on Rowan's interactions with the wolf's supporters, Dr. Braxton, a handful of wildlife enthusiasts, and even a couple of neighbors who'd heard rumors of his rescue. While some praised him for saving a dangerous predator, others worried he was playing with fire. One neighbor bluntly asked, "What if these poachers come after you for interfering with their business? You'd be better off keeping your head down." But Rowan found he couldn't abide the notion of turning a blind eye. In the wolf's quiet gratitude, he sensed a reflection of his own humanity, an affirmation that compassion could stand against even the darkest impulses of greed and cruelty. That night, sleep eluded him. He sat by the fireplace, mulling over whether to coordinate with Sorensen for a more deliberate patrol of the areas he once roamed alone. From the battered trunk that belonged to his father, Rowan pulled out a dusty old camera. Though archaic, it might serve to document whatever he stumbled upon: a broken snare, footprints, traces of illegal camps. If shining a light on these activities was their best chance to protect not only this wolf, but the entire pack, Rowan resolved to do it. In that resolve, he felt the last vestiges of doubt slip away. Outside, an icy moon bathed the snow in silver. Rowan stood at the window, imagining the wolf in Dr. Braxton's clinic, healing, gathering strength. Tomorrow he would visit again, perhaps ask if the wolf was ready to come home. The idea of sharing his cabin with such a creature both thrilled and unsettled him. But a quiet voice within insisted this bond was no coincidence. The mother wolf he'd never met, the savage trap set by faceless hunters, the dogged survival of this battered beast, pieces of a larger story woven by fate. It was up to Rowan now, and the network of allies forming around him, to see this story through, even if it meant confronting shadows far more menacing than a single wire snare. Over the next few days, the peaceful veneer of Rowan's remote life gave way to a swirl of new subplots and challenges that neither he nor the recuperating wolf could have anticipated. While the wolf's health in Dr. Braxton's care showed signs of steady improvement, the shadowy threat posed by poachers and illegal trappers loomed larger than ever. One afternoon, a battered pickup truck pulled into the gravel lot in front of the vet clinic just as Rowan arrived for his visit. A burly man stepped out, scanning the area with a suspicious glare. Rowan kept his distance, watching from beside his own truck. Something about the man's stance, tense shoulders, eyes flickering toward the clinic door, set off alarms. A short while later, he hopped back in the pickup and roared off, leaving Rowan feeling a chill that had little to do with the crisp winter air. Inside, Dr. Braxton greeted Rowan with a tense half-smile. He claimed to be looking for a missing hunting dog, she explained under her breath. I asked for specifics, but he gave vague answers. The moment I hinted about microchip records, he bolted. She shrugged, trying to appear unfazed, but Rowan caught the worry in her eyes. We're not certain he's connected to that ring, but it doesn't feel right, she concluded. Rowan silently agreed, mind racing with the possibility that individuals involved in wolf poaching might be scouring local vet clinics for leads. The following morning, Rowan made the trek into town to speak again with Ranger Sorensen. Their brief conversation only heightened his unease. There had been 2 more reports of snares discovered near the edges of the forest, each carefully hidden on less traveled game trails. None had yet caught a wolf, thankfully, but Sorensen noted that the style and construction of these traps resembled the one that had nearly claimed Rowan's wolf. They're persistent, the ranger muttered grimly, and they won't stop until they get what they're after, whether that's fur, bones, or trophies. Another subplot emerged when Miss Hawkins, the freelance journalist covering Rowan's wolf rescue, reached out for an in-depth interview. She wanted to expose the broader issue of illegal trapping, hoping that public outcry might spur government action. Rowan hesitated. He feared that shining a spotlight on the wolf could put both man and animal in greater danger from those lurking in the shadows. Yet Hawkins argued that silence only enabled cruelty. If enough people learn about this, she insisted, the perpetrators might rethink their brazen tactics. Knowledge can be a powerful deterrent. Torn between caution and responsibility, Rowan tentatively agreed to a recorded conversation, but insisted she omit any details that would pinpoint his location or the wolf's exact whereabouts. Meanwhile, back at the cabin, Rowan worked feverishly to prepare for the wolf's return. With Dr. Braxton's approval, the animal would soon be stable enough to convalesce under Rowan's direct care, provided he followed a strict regimen of medications and wound management. Each day, Rowan expanded the makeshift enclosure near the fireplace, laying down more blankets and reinforcing the low wooden barrier he'd erected. A nagging thought lingered in his mind. What if the wolf, once strong enough, tried to bolt back into the wild? Or worse, what if it attacked him in a moment of pain or confusion? Still, he couldn't bring himself to chain or cage a creature he believed deserved the freedom it had so nearly lost. When Lily, a neighbor's teenage daughter who sometimes delivered fresh produce to Rowan's doorstep, heard of his endeavor, she timidly offered to help. Rowan hesitated, recalling how the wolf reacted to strangers. But Lily's gentle demeanor and fascination with wildlife convinced him to accept her assistance, at least with preparing meals and tidying the cabin. This alliance introduced a new subplot, the blossoming friendship between Rowan, a solitary soul who'd mostly kept to himself, and the wide-eyed teen eager to learn about wilderness survival and animal care. Their dynamic, Rowan's reserved nature clashing with Lily's curiosity, sparked small conflicts, often revolving around Lily's push to see the wolf and Rowan's protective instincts. Yet beneath the occasional tension lay a shared reverence for life and a desire to shield the forest's inhabitants from human greed. The wolf's arrival back at the cabin carefully transported in a borrowed animal crate, marked the beginning of another chapter. Though limping and still bandaged, it moved with a cautious determination that hinted at renewed vigor. Rowan found himself marveling at how its once lifeless eyes now shone with a quiet, guarded intelligence. Each time he administered antibiotics, or tried to coax it to eat the vet-recommended meals, the wolf would lock eyes with him, an unspoken understanding passing between them. That strange, almost spiritual bond that began in a snowy clearing had only intensified through the trials they'd weathered. But the pressures from outside forces continued to mount. Rowan occasionally spotted a faded grey pickup lurking at crossroads or on the periphery of his land. Sometimes, as he drove into town for supplies, he sensed someone tailing him, though he could never be sure. Ranger Sorensen, stretched thin investigating multiple suspicious incidents, could offer little direct protection. "Watch your back," was the ranger's grave advice. If these folks are indeed hunting wolves illegally, they might not hesitate to intimidate anyone in their way. These complications merged into a volatile mix: a partially recovered wolf in a cramped cabin, rumors of intensifying illegal activity in the nearby woods, and a community teetering between outrage and fear. Rowan, once content with solitude, found himself coordinating with the ranger, the vet, and even Ms. Hawkins in an unplanned coalition. Each ally carried their own motivations and fears. Dr. Braxton sought to protect animals under her charge. Hawkins wanted a story that could spark real change. Sorensen tried to uphold the law in a domain where criminals thrived on secrecy. And Lily, the helpful teen neighbor, yearned to see the wolf roam free without the shadow of human cruelty. In quieter moments, as the wolf slept fitfully near the hearth, Rowan contemplated the unforeseen subplots of his life. He had not sought heroism, nor had he planned to wage a personal war against wildlife exploiters. Yet the path chosen by a single merciful act now demanded a steadfast commitment. Perhaps it was destiny, or perhaps it was the simple truth that once you save a life, you bear a piece of that life's future. Exhausted but determined, he resolved that every thread in this tapestry, Rusty's slow healing, the threat of lurking poachers, the fragile alliances formed, would culminate in a stand for the very soul of the wilderness he loved. And in that stand, he sensed the seeds of a miracle only beginning to unfold. A thin coat of fresh snow dusted the pines outside Rowan's cabin, and the mid-morning sun lent a deceptive warmth to the frigid air. Inside, the atmosphere crackled with a tension born of tangled obligations and uncertain loyalties. Rowan had grown accustomed to sharing his small space with the injured wolf, a creature that, despite improvements, remained undeniably wild. Yet each passing day underscored how fragile their arrangement was. The wolf's leg wound had begun to scab over, but the deeper scars, fear of humans, a primal wariness, surfaced at the slightest provocation, setting off a wave of low growls or a trembling retreat into a corner. That morning, Lily, the teenage neighbor who'd volunteered to help, arrived with a plastic container of leftover stew. Her eyes sparkled with both curiosity and concern as she watched the wolf. "You've come so far," she murmured to the animal, carefully edging closer. The wolf, lying on a blanket near the fireplace, lifted its head, ears pricking. Sensing Lily's gentle intent, it didn't growl but kept a cautious gaze on her every movement. Rowan observed from across the room, worried the wolf might lash out if startled, yet somehow trusting this uncertain dance of empathy. To his relief, the wolf accepted a small piece of meat from Lily's outstretched hand, swallowing it with tentative acceptance. It was an image almost too tender for Rowan to believe, a predator forging a delicate truce with a young human. And yet, that image also highlighted an uncomfortable truth. Eventually, if the wolf fully healed, it belonged back in the wild. Keeping it tethered to domesticated routines felt like both a betrayal of its nature and an open invitation for conflict with neighbors, officials, and possibly the ring of poachers that seemed to prowl these parts. The dilemma gnawed at Rowan: protect the wolf by domesticating it, or set it free to fend for itself in a forest haunted by snares and hunters. Complicating matters further was Lily's increasingly personal investment in the wolf's story. She confessed to Rowan that she'd posted about it on her social media accounts, seeking advice or resources, innocently unaware that such posts could draw unwanted attention. One evening, she arrived at the cabin with a flustered look. "People online are asking where to find you. Some claim they want to help more, but others sound strange," she explained, chewing her lip in worry. Rowan felt a pang of alarm. "We've got to be careful," he muttered. "We don't know who might be watching." Meanwhile, Ms. Hawkins, the journalist, continued her research into local poaching rings. She'd uncovered unsettling stories from neighboring counties, reports of wolves disappearing, occasional gunshots heard at night, and shells of illegal traps discovered near logging roads. Over a hasty cup of coffee in Rowan's cabin, she summarized her findings, her voice tinged with frustration. "These operations thrive on secrecy and fear. If no one speaks up or collects evidence, they flourish. But if you or I push too hard, we risk being targeted." She glanced warily at the wolf dozing near the hearth. Yet staying silent means accepting that more animals will suffer the same fate. The fatherly ranger, Sorensen, grew similarly entangled in the fray. He started dropping by Rowan's place, leaving cryptic warnings about suspicious vehicles or fresh footprints spotted in the snow. More than once, he encouraged Rowan to consider handing the wolf over to a proper wildlife rehabilitation center. "They're equipped to handle rewilding," he insisted. "You might be hindering its natural instincts by keeping it here." Yet Rowan, though he respected Sorensen's viewpoint, couldn't shake the sense of destiny that had shaped his bond with the wolf. Each time he prepared to step away from the creature, the memory of its pleading eyes in the trap and its growing trust in him drew him back. Tensions also simmered in Rowan's relationship with Lily's father, who worried about his daughter spending time around a lethal predator. One dusk, the man confronted Rowan at the cabin's doorstep, scowling as he surveyed the wolf's silhouette by the window. "I appreciate you saved it," he said tersely, "but do you realize what could happen if it attacks Lily or someone else? Wild wolves don't just unlearn centuries of instinct because a human showed them kindness." Rowan, swallowing a retort, tried to explain the precautions he'd taken, supervised interactions, limited contact. But the father remained unconvinced. "Kindness is admirable, but not if it puts my daughter at risk." In the midst of these swirling dilemmas, the wolf itself remained the silent axis around which every conflict revolved. Rowan noted subtle shifts in the animal's behavior, longer naps, brief moments of curiosity where it sniffed at the door or gazed out a window as though yearning for the forest. Sometimes, late at night, it would pace near the threshold, whining softly at the moonlit expanse beyond. Observing this, Rowan felt a pang of empathy. He recognized the call of nature in the wolf's restless steps, just as he recognized the peril that lay beyond the safety of his cabin walls. Caught between external threats and internal doubts, Rowan grappled with the emotional weight of deciding the wolf's fate. A creeping guilt nibbled at him for withholding the animal from its homeland. Yet every time he pictured releasing it back into a world dotted with wire traps and guns, an icy dread clamped his chest. If something happened, if the wolf wound up in another snare, how would he live with himself? The turning point arrived when the wolf, grown steadily stronger, began testing its boundaries more aggressively. One snowy morning, Lily arrived to find it pawing at a window, whining to get outside. Rowan, concerned it might run off half-healed, hesitated. But Lily, her breath visible in the cold air, whispered, "He's telling us he wants to feel the snow under his paws, to remember what it's like to be free." Compromising, Rowan carefully slipped a makeshift leash around the wolf's collar, and the three ventured into the yard, forging a precarious dance between domestication and wild longing. The scene that unfolded, wolf's paw prints marring the pristine snow, Lily beaming as the animal sniffed tree bark with renewed curiosity, glowed with a fleeting sense of peace. Yet, in the back of Rowan's mind, the warnings from Sorensen and Miss Hawkins remained. A single stray bullet or hidden snare could shatter this fragile tranquility. The undercurrent of danger lent every moment a bittersweet edge, reminding them all that the wolf's journey was far from over and the darkest challenge might still lie ahead. The fragile harmony Rowan and the wolf had forged teetered on a thin edge. As new pressures mounted in the frozen wilderness, each day brought fresh tidings of trouble, an illicit sighting in the woods, a neighbor's hushed warning about strange footprints circling the cabin at dawn. Although the wolf's leg wound steadily healed under Rowan's constant care, the sense of looming peril only deepened. One late afternoon, as a pale sun hovered low in the sky, Lily arrived in her usual burst of winter clothes and a bright smile, carrying a small parcel of homemade treats for the wolf. She froze mid-step when she spotted Rowan conversing in tense whispers with Ranger Sorensen at the cabin's threshold. A quick glance between the two men revealed grim faces, lips pressed tight. "We found more snares," Sorensen explained, nodding at Lily in a curt greeting. "Worse, we found fresh tracks, boot prints leading away from them. Whoever set those traps likely knows there's a wolf being sheltered here, or at least they suspect it." Rowan swallowed the knot in his throat. "They're closing in," he muttered. Lily's eyes widened, the weight of his words draping a hushed silence over the cabin. The teenage girl, who had grown to love the wolf's gentle presence, placed her treats on the table with trembling hands. "We can't just let them take him," she said, her young voice trembling. Sorensen sighed. "We've stepped up patrols, but this forest is vast. If these individuals are as methodical as we suspect, they'll lie low until we're gone, then move in." Later that evening, Ms. Hawkins visited, her breath visible in the freezing air as she carried a small handheld camera. Her tone urgent, she pressed Rowan about sharing more details to expose the ring of poachers. Public pressure could force local officials to act faster, she insisted. But Rowan's nerves bristled at the thought of plastering the wolf's story, and possibly his location, across the media. "Every broadcast is another chance those criminals learn where to strike," he argued. "We can't risk drawing them here." Ms. Hawkins, torn between a reporter's drive to shine a spotlight on injustice and her growing empathy for Rowan's dilemma, agreed to hold off on anything that might pinpoint the cabin. Still, the tension rippled between them, a clash of truth versus safety. In the days that followed, the wolf's strength returned in bursts. While it still limped on the injured leg, each step grew more sure. Rowan watched it wander around the yard's perimeter, nose to the ground, as though reacquainting itself with the scent of open air. Yet the wolf remained restless. At night it would pace inside the cabin, whining softly as if the call of the wild forest beyond was almost unbearable. At times, Rowan considered unlocking the front gate and letting it slip into the frosty twilight, but the images of fresh snares and mysterious strangers lingered in his mind, forbidding such a risky decision. Meanwhile, Lily's father, worried sick about his daughter's involvement, confronted Rowan one chilly morning. "My girl's been coming here almost daily, but we're hearing there are dangerous people prowling around," he said, voice trembling with protective anger. "You want to care for that beast, fine, but keep Lily out of harm's way." Rowan understood the father's fear, glimpsing the same protective instinct he himself felt for the wolf. Yet, Lily's contributions, helping feed the wolf, easing its nervousness around humans, had become integral to its recovery. The two men parted with uneasy words, each grudgingly respecting the other's viewpoint, yet refusing to yield. The tension escalated further when Dr. Braxton called Rowan with news of a break-in at her clinic. Someone had rummaged through old patient files, as if searching for a record that might point them to a certain wolf. Nothing was stolen outright, but the message was clear. The wolf's hunters were growing bolder. "I'm worried, and Rowan," she admitted. "I can't hide the fact that you brought a wolf to me. If they're persistent, they'll piece the clues together." His pulse hammered as he thanked her for the warning, feeling the net of danger constrict even tighter around the life he'd saved. Faced with mounting threats, Rowan began to form a plan more daring than he'd ever imagined. Meeting discreetly with Ranger Sorensen and Ms. Hawkins at a small clearing behind the ranger station, he outlined an idea: a stakeout operation to gather photographic evidence of the snare setters. "If we can catch them red-handed," he reasoned, "the law can't ignore it. We free the forest of these killers, and the wolf can safely return home." Sorensen agreed to coordinate a small team of off-duty rangers, while Ms. Hawkins, adrenaline sparking in her eyes, pledged to use her camera and platform to broadcast any proof they uncovered. Lily, who'd learned of the plan through hushed conversations, begged to join but was gently refused by both Rowan and her father. "You've done enough," Rowan insisted. "These woods at night aren't safe for you." As the day of the planned stakeout approached, A charged energy coursed through Rowan's cabin. He prepared emergency supplies, extra blankets, a first aid kit, some old flares he'd once found in his father's tool chest. The wolf, sensing something amiss, grew more agitated, pacing restlessly. Part of Rowan longed to reassure it. Soon, perhaps, the forest would be safe again. But a lingering doubt gnawed at him. Even if they stopped a few poachers, how could he guarantee the wolf's long-term safety in a world that so often overlooked the sanctity of wild lives? The stage was set for a confrontation that promised to test everyone. Rowan, the wolf, and the fledgling alliance of rangers and concerned citizens. Each fleeting moment of quiet, each gentle flick of the wolf's ears, only heightened the sense that the crucial battle loomed. Through frost-kissed evenings, Lily continued to visit, speaking softly to the wolf as though confiding secrets in a friend. Rowan, watching them, realized that whether or not he believed in destiny, events had conspired to bring them all together for a reason. The wolf, once ensnared and left to freeze, had ignited a spark of defiance against a wider cruelty. Now, that spark threatened to burn bright enough to reshape the fate of this wild corner of the world. Yet as the hours ticked closer to the stakeout, Rowan's heart pounded with lingering fear. What if they failed to catch the poachers in the act? What if these menacing figures retaliated with violence that no single ranger patrol could stop? Balancing on a knife's edge between courage and trepidation, Rowan quietly tightened the wolf's bandage one last time that evening, stroking its head in silent acknowledgement of the risk they both faced. Neither man nor beast could turn back now. The path ahead was fraught, and the final test of their bond, indeed the final chance for a miracle, lay in the darkness of the forest, where their stand against cruelty would finally unfold. That quiet morning, frost clung to the windows of Rowan's cabin, etching delicate patterns in the glass. Inside, the wolf stirred, still favoring its injured leg, but moving with greater assurance. Rowan crouched beside it, carefully checking the bandage. Doctor. Braxton had changed the previous afternoon. The wound's edges had closed some, and while the wolf still bore a scar, it now seemed more restless than wounded, as if sensing a shift in the air. Across the room, Lily hovered in her puffy jacket, her breath steaming in the chilly space near the door. She'd come to help feed the wolf and to glean any updates about the planned stakeout against the poachers. Rowan noticed her anxious glances, her foot tapping the worn cabin floor. He understood that Lily felt invested not just in the wolf's future, but in the broader struggle they had uncovered, an entire network of cruelty that thrived in secrecy. "Any news from Ranger Sorensen?" she asked softly, petting the wolf's head. Rowan exhaled. "They're finalizing details. We'll watch certain areas where snares were found, try to document any illegal activity." Yet, for all the talk of exposing the criminals, the subplots tying each character together continued to evolve in unexpected ways. Ms. Hawkins, for instance, had grown far more involved than any freelance journalist typically would. She'd begun interviewing locals about the wolf crisis, gathering stories of missing dogs and cryptic footprints. A subtle shift happened when she discovered an old photo of a wolf mother and pups taken near Rowan's homestead, decades ago. The mother wolf bore a distinct marking above one eye, remarkably similar to the scar the rescued wolf carried. Could it be a descendant of that lineage, a remnant of a family once plentiful in these woods? The possibility stirred Mrs. Hawkins' curiosity and added a new dimension. Saving this wolf might also mean preserving a storied bloodline, a living link to the region's natural heritage. Meanwhile, Lily's father, who had repeatedly warned her about the dangers, now found his own emotions tangled. Each night he paced their home, torn between wanting to shield Lily from the potential confrontation and grudgingly admiring her unwavering compassion. He contacted Rowan late one evening, proposing that he be involved in case things turn ugly at the stakeout. Although Rowan had initial reservations, worried about the father's protective instincts clashing with the ranger's methods, he recognized the man's resolve. They could use every ally possible. In a parallel development, Dr. Braxton discreetly confided to Rowan that she'd received emails from what appeared to be an animal smuggling ring, asking if she had any knowledge of a recovered wolf. Though the messages were vague, they hinted at monetary offers for information. Dr. Braxton felt both outrage and alarm. She warned Rowan that such groups had no qualms about threatening or bribing veterinarians who crossed their path. The more word spread about the wolf's survival, the higher the stakes soared. "We're dealing with people who see animals as commodities," she cautioned. "If they realize this wolf could link them to illegal operations, they might lash out." All these threads converged into a tapestry of escalating tension. Rowan, usually a loner who relished the solitude of his cabin, found himself at the nexus of an unlikely coalition: a teenage girl inspired by kindness, a ranger sworn to protect wildlife, a journalist seeking justice, and a vet determined to save lives. Each brought a distinct motive to the table, yet all were bound by one goal: to protect the wolf from those who would exploit or destroy it, and in doing so, shine a light on a deeper cruelty poisoning their community. The wolf, oblivious to these complex human plots, nevertheless sensed the unrest. It prowled the cabin restlessly, waking Rowan at odd hours with soft whines or insistent nudges at the door. Rowan, half asleep, would sometimes let it venture into the enclosed yard, always on a makeshift lead, scanning the tree line for any hint of movement. On a particularly bright afternoon, the wolf perked its ears and sniffed at the wind as though remembering what true freedom felt like. Rowan felt a pang of guilt. Protecting the wolf came at the cost of restricting its innate wildness, yet releasing it too soon might mean handing it right back to the steel jaws of a snare. Gradually, whispers grew in the local town as well. People reported seeing a half-healed wolf near the edges of trails, seemingly escorted by a cautious man. Some shared admiration for Rowan's rescue efforts, while others voiced fear that coddling a predator was a fool's errand. Rumors circulated of a possible reward for returning any wolf in decent condition to certain shady operators, prompting townsfolk to keep an uneasy distance from Rowan and Lily's mission. These rumors, in turn, fueled Lily's father's worry, aware that unscrupulous individuals might view the wolf's location as a quick payday. The resulting isolation only strengthened the bond among those who genuinely sought to help. Mrs. Hawkins doubled down on her investigative efforts, forging connections with out-of-state rescue groups and animal rights advocates. She believed that a public outcry could hamper the poachers' covert activities. Yet, with every interview or blog post she prepared, Rowan's nerves frayed further, fearing that the criminals might interpret any publicity as a direct challenge, spurring them to more aggressive tactics. And so, on the eve of the planned stakeout, tensions in the cabin reached a quivering apex. The father dropped off extra supplies, speaking in hushed tones. Lily, though forbidden from attending the night vigil, hovered around Rusty, as she'd nicknamed the wolf, though Rowan simply called it Wolf, murmuring tearful good lucks. Ranger Sorensen, clad in thick winter gear, stopped by to finalize timings and coordinate vantage points, his usually calm demeanor taut with anticipation. Their plan was simple but fraught with risk. A small team would covertly spread out across the known snare locations, cameras at the ready, hoping to catch the perpetrators in the act. Before Sorensen departed, Rowan asked quietly, "And if we fail?" The ranger's grave expression said it all. "Then we'll try again, or the next time. But we have to start somewhere." Doing nothing just encourages them. The wolf, lying by the crackling fireplace, regarded them with a calm that contrasted the tension in the air. In that moment, it was easy to believe this creature, once battered and near death, had become the linchpin of a community's moral stand. Night fell slowly, the sky a swirl of deep blues and pinpricks of starlight. Rowan packed essentials: flashlights, a thermos of coffee, a phone loaded with Sorensen's number, and steeled himself. Outside, the wind rattled the pines, and in the distance, a lone coyote's cry echoed. Lily and her father shared a last supportive nod with Rowan, each silently hoping the coming confrontation would bring resolution instead of disaster. The wolf watched from behind the window, eyes reflecting the flicker of Rowan's lantern as he stepped into the cold. It was as if it, one too, sensed the final chords of a drama about to ring out across the silent, snow-blanketed land. The stage was set for the most critical moment in Rowan's hidden battle against the poachers. As late evening shadows stretched across the snowy wilderness, he drove cautiously down a rutted path, following Ranger Sorensen's instructions on where to rendezvous for the stakeout. In the passenger seat, Miss Hawkins clutched her camera equipment, eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The atmosphere in the truck was tense, underscored by the muffled rumble of the engine and the quiet exhalations that betrayed each passenger's apprehension. At a small clearing tucked between towering pines, they found Sorensen's unmarked patrol car parked inconspicuously. The ranger stood outside, his breath visible in the frigid air, a map in hand showing the suspected snare locations. Without exchanging more than a few hushed words, the group split up into pairs. Sorensen with one of his fellow rangers, Rowan with Ms. Hawkins, each aiming to stake out separate trails. Their mission: gather photographic or video evidence of anyone tampering with the illegal snares, then call in backup to make arrests. Rowan's mind drifted back to the battered wolf resting at his cabin, Lily by its side, likely trying to soothe the creature's nervous energy. He felt a pang of guilt leaving them behind, but if tonight went as planned, they might finally put an end to the threat hanging over both the wolf and the entire forest. Before parting, Sorensen handed Rowan a small handheld radio. "One channel. If you see anything, whisper your position and we'll converge," the ranger instructed, his tone grim. Rowan nodded, swallowing hard. The reality that they were walking into a trap that could backfire weighed on him more than ever, as Ms. Hawkins and Rowan trudged through the powdery snow. Each step felt amplified by the silence of the winter woods. Occasionally, Miss Hawkins snapped a photo of tracks in the snow, boot prints or partial animal paw marks, and jotted quick notes in a small pad. Rowan carried a flashlight with a red filter to avoid alerting any watchers, and a thermos of lukewarm coffee that did little to stave off the chill in his bones. They eventually settled behind a fallen log near a gully known for frequent wildlife traffic. Rumor had it the poachers favored such hidden spots to set snares. They waited, breath steaming, senses straining for any noise. An hour passed, then another, with only the occasional distant hoot of an owl or the rustle of a nocturnal animal scurrying through the brush. The tedium tested their patience, but neither dared to speak above a whisper. Then, faintly at first, Mrs. Hawkins' keen ears picked up a crunch of footsteps. She tapped Rowan's shoulder, heart thudding. Peering around the log, Rowan spotted shifting beams of light, flashlights or headlamps bobbing through the trees. With painstaking care, they adjusted their position, Miss Hawkins readying her camera, Rowan keeping his radio at hand. Two figures emerged from the darkness, each wearing heavy coats and carrying what looked like long metal rods. From the silhouette, it appeared they were checking ground-level spots along the trail, precisely the kind of furtive action that spelled resetting or checking traps. Rowan's pulse accelerated. If they could record these men at work, they'd have indisputable proof of their illegal snaring. Miss Hawkins began filming, her camera's lens peeking over the log. Through the viewfinder, she could see one man bend down, fiddling with something. The other stood guard, glancing around warily. Rowan wondered if they had guns, no easy feat to confirm in the moonlit gloom. Every second felt like an eternity, Mrs. Hawkins holding her breath to keep the camera steady. Suddenly, one of the men hissed a warning. He had spotted a shape in the distance, likely Sorensen's colleague on another trail, though the shape vanished. Tension crackled in the air as the men pulled out flashlights, shining them frantically across the undergrowth. Ms. Hawkins froze, pressing herself against the log. Rowan gripped the radio, considering whether to call Sorensen, but the risk of noise might expose them. In the flickering beams, he saw the faint glint of a steel wire trap being recoiled and stashed into a bag. A gust of wind swept through the grove, rattling branches overhead. The men, apparently spooked, began to move quickly away. Ms. Hawkins cursed under her breath, frustrated they might flee before the rangers could arrive. Signaling to Rowan, she gestured with her camera, silently conveying that she had enough footage to prove wrongdoing. Rowan exhaled in relief, though the men were about to slip out of sight. Should he radio Sorensen to intercept them? Without warning, a third figure burst onto the scene, a ranger from Sorensen's team. "Stay where you are," a voice barked. Pandemonium erupted. One of the suspects whipped around, brandishing what looked like a rifle. In the confusion, Miss Hawkins stifled a gasp, her camera rattling in her hands, The other suspect dropped the bag of snares and sprinted into the dense pines. Shots rang out, maybe warning shots from the ranger, or a wild retort from the armed suspect. Rowan found himself ducking behind the log, dragging Ms. Hawkins with him. His heart hammered so loudly it drowned out all other sound. He craned his neck to see the suspect with the rifle disappearing into darkness. The ranger, pinned by the risk of return fire, didn't pursue, shouting into his radio for backup instead. In that dizzying moment, Miss Hawkins, breath unsteady, checked her camera. "I caught them on tape," she whispered, adrenaline surging. They can't deny what they were doing now. But Rowan's relief was short-lived. One suspect had escaped, carrying who knew what knowledge back to his associates, and the one with the rifle might still be lurking. The policeman's voice crackled over Rowan's radio. "Officer down. No, scratch that. He's wounded but stable. We need an ambulance. Watch your six." The suspects scattered. Ms. Hawkins looked at Rowan, face pale under the faint moonlight. "We have evidence, but at what cost?" He swallowed, scanning the trembling pines. Somewhere out there, predators of a different breed prowled. Men who saw the forest as a mere hunting ground for illegal profit. If they discovered the camera footage or learned Rowan had assisted this operation, revenge was a distinct possibility. Still, a steely resolve hardened in Rowan's gut. They had come this far. The confrontation might be messy, but justice for the wolf and all animals targeted by these killers demanded they see it through. The radio erupted with more frantic chatter. Ranger Sorensen's voice, tight with urgency, directed units to seal off roads and set up checkpoints. "We've got enough evidence to press charges," he announced. "No one let your guard down. They might circle back or try to destroy proof." Ms. Hawkins, clutching her camera like a lifeline, nodded numbly. Rowan knelt there, adrenaline coursing, realizing how close they'd come to a lethal showdown and how precariously the next hours would unfold. Above them, the moon slid behind a bank of clouds, plunging the clearing into deeper gloom. The stage was set for the final act of this tense drama. The men who trafficked in suffering had been partially unmasked, yet remained at large, still capable of striking back. The evidence Miss Hawkins captured might tip the scales, or it might provoke an even more savage response. And amid the swirling chaos, Rowan's thoughts turned to the wolf, resting back at his cabin under Lily's watchful eye. If the criminals discovered where he lived, the miracle of saving that life could end in tragedy. Bracing himself, Rowan realized the true climax was at hand, where courage and cruelty would meet head-on, and only one would triumph. In the aftermath of the chaotic stakeout, the ranger station buzzed with frantic energy. The wounded officer had been rushed to a nearby hospital with a minor gunshot wound, while two of the suspected poachers had vanished into the deep woods. Though the evidence Ms. Hawkins captured on her camera provided a clear view of illegal snares and armed men, the suspects' identities remained uncertain. Tension simmered among the rangers. Some insisted they had enough proof to raid suspected hideouts, while others urged caution, unwilling to risk more lives without a solid lead on the ring's full membership. Rowan, hands still shaking from the night's events, tried to gather his thoughts in a corner of the station's small lobby. Mrs. Hawkins slumped against a wall, reviewing the footage on her camera. Every so often, she winced at the memory of gunshots shattering the silent forest. "I've covered plenty of tough stories," she murmured, "but never been in the line of fire." Rowan offered her a shaky nod, his own heart still galloping from the close brush with violence. Ranger Sorensen approached, fatigue evident in the lines creasing his face. "We've forwarded the footage to the county prosecutor," he explained, "and we've got men scouring the back roads, hoping to cut off an escape route. But these guys know the terrain. They might vanish if they get deep enough into the wilderness." His gaze flicked between Rowan and Mims. Hawkins, softened by a weary empathy. "I wish I could promise immediate arrests, but I can't. You two need to stay alert. They might blame you for this botched attempt and retaliate." Later that morning, Rowan drove back toward his cabin, Ms. Hawkins in the passenger seat. Though the sun rose high, chasing away the night's shadows, neither felt relief. If anything, daylight only highlighted how vulnerable they remained. At the cabin, Lily's father stood guard outside, arms folded, as Lily peered anxiously from the doorway. Seeing Rowan's truck, she rushed forward, her eyes darting between him and Miss Hawkins. "Are you okay? What happened?" she breathed, concern etched on her face. Rowan offered a terse summary of the stakeout gone awry, the brief confrontation, and the suspect's escape. Lily's father paled at mention of gunfire, anger mingling with fear. "This is exactly what I worried about. We should pack up, relocate Rusty to a safer facility. It's not worth risking lives." His words hammered an uneasy chord. Lily, lips trembling, glanced toward the wolf resting by the hearth, as if the mere suggestion of sending him away was a betrayal. But the father's argument weighed heavily. The threat was real, and the criminals might lash out for revenge. Meanwhile, Miss Hawkins set her camera on the table, exhaling sharply. "I promised I'd help expose this," she said quietly, "but now I realize how personal it's become. For all of us. If we don't stand firm, they'll keep terrorizing anyone who stands in their way." Lily's mother, drawn by the commotion, appeared in the cabin's doorway. Her gaze flicked to Rusty, who, though stronger, still bore a haunted look whenever unfamiliar footsteps approached. She pursed her lips and nodded, resigned yet resolute. "We can't give him up to cruelty," she murmured, voice soft but unyielding. As the group convened around the small living area, tension crackled like static. Every argument had merit. Keeping Rusty nearby might invite further danger, yet handing him over to an overwhelmed rescue or releasing him prematurely could doom him in a forest riddled with snares. Finally, Lily's father turned to Ranger Sorensen, who had arrived moments earlier to collect statements, and asked, "What's the official advice? We obviously can't handle armed criminals alone, but we can't just hide either." Sorensen rubbed his temples, choosing his words carefully. "We've got your statements and Ms. Hawkins' footage. That's a strong start. The best move now is to cooperate fully with our investigation. Let us handle the criminals. You keep the wolf secure here, or consider a short-term specialized shelter. And keep your heads down." Yet, as Sorensen spoke, the wolf lifted its head, ears alert, as though sensing the tension in human voices. Lily knelt by its side, tears brimming, whispering, "Don't worry, we won't let them hurt you." Her vow resonated with Rowan, recalling the day he found the animal near death. He'd risked everything to save it once. Could he walk away now? Rising, he cleared his throat. "I'll do whatever it takes. If that means relocating him to a safe haven under guard, or if it means staying here, I accept it. But I won't abandon him." The father exhaled, shoulders slackening in reluctant acceptance. He shot Rowan a wary nod, acknowledging their combined duty to protect Lily and Rusty. Ms. Hawkins, too, seemed to find renewed resolve, tucking a stray hair behind her ear. "We can release an update on the story, share the footage we got, push the public to demand action. The criminals thrive in darkness. Maybe if we shine a big enough light, they'll scurry away." At that moment, the quiet cabin was pierced by the buzz of Sorensen's radio. A muffled dispatch reported a suspicious vehicle near the outskirts of Ashwood, a truck matching the description of the men they'd encountered. Sorensen stiffened, turning to Rowan. "They're still in the area. Keep your doors locked and your phone closed. I'll head out." With a curt goodbye, he strode into the bright winter sunlight, leaving the family and Miss Hawkins staring after him. As tension settled like a heavy blanket, Lily's father broke the silence. "If they come here, we call the Rangers immediately. And Lily," he fixed her with a stern gaze, "you keep away from the door, understood?" Lily nodded, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, her face etched with a longing to prove braver than her years allowed. Rowan's chest tightened, understanding the real possibility of another confrontation. Rusty, picking up the mood, paced the cabin, letting out soft whines that reminded them how far he'd come and how precarious his future remained. In that hush, Ms. Hawkins gently asked Lily's mother, "What do we do if the criminals don't back down, if they target the cabin next?" The mother swallowed, glancing from Lily to the wolf, and then to Rowan. Her response, though barely above a whisper, carried the force of determination. "We stand our ground, protect him like we protected each other. Because if we don't, what kind of people are we?" In that answer, the lines were drawn, as each character steeled themselves for what they sensed would be the final showdown, a confrontation that could either solidify their courage as a miracle or scatter their hopes to the wind. Night descended with an oppressive hush, as though the frigid wind itself conspired to stifle every sound. In Rowan's cabin, a somber vigil took shape. Lily's father kept watch by the window, eyes scanning the moonlit tree line for any hint of movement. Lily's mother clutched her phone, Ranger Sorensen's number pre-dialed. Miss Hawkins paced near the wolf's makeshift enclosure, camera at the ready, determined not to miss a single moment if the perpetrators returned. Meanwhile, Lily sat close to Rusty, the injured wolf, offering quiet strokes to calm his anxious whining. Each occupant of the cramped space felt the tension seeping into their bones, as though fate held its breath in anticipation of a final confrontation. Outside, the forest loomed in silent majesty, every frost-laden branch highlighted by pale moonlight. The hush was deceptive. Rowan knew an unknown number of poachers could be creeping closer under the night's veil. The stakeout had rattled them, but not deterred them entirely. If anything, it might have fueled their anger. Through the window's reflection, Rowan glimpsed Lily, face pinched with worry, and the wolf pressing its muzzle against her side. He couldn't shake the feeling that every second stretched them closer to a tipping point, one that could end in tragedy or triumph. Close to midnight, a faint sound jolted everyone to attention, the crunch of footsteps on snow, approaching from the direction of the main road. Lily's father exchanged a tense glance with Rowan, then carefully unlatched the door, stepping onto the porch. He peered into the moonlit yard, hand hovering near the flashlight clipped to his belt. Mrs. Hawkins stood behind him with her camera, breath clouding around her. For a moment, it seemed like a trick of the wind. Then a figure emerged, Ranger Sorensen, breathless and alone. He stepped onto the porch, voice low. "We found fresh footprints near a path leading directly behind your cabin," he reported grimly. "No sign of the suspects yet, but it's clear they're circling back." A charged stillness gripped the group. Lily's mother murmured a shaky, "They won't stop until they get what they want, will they?" Sorensen's silence spoke volumes. Inside, Lily steadied herself. She refused to leave Rusty's side, even as her father urged her to go to a neighbor's place for safety. "I'm not running," she said, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "He needs me here." The father, anguish battling pride in his expression, let her decision stand. Rowan, grim-faced, grabbed the old hunting rifle he kept solely for emergencies, checking its chamber with a nervous flick of his thumb. The wolf, sensing the mounting fear, limped around restlessly, ears pricked at every snapping twig outside. Time stretched taut as they waited, nerves keyed to a pitch. Sorensen and Mrs. Hawkins set themselves up behind sturdy furniture by the windows, hoping to capture any incriminating approach. Lily's parents hovered in the center of the room, radios set to the ranger's frequency. Rowan positioned himself near the door with the rifle, heart pounding in a relentless rhythm. He yearned for the peaceful routine he once knew, chopping wood at dawn, brewing coffee in a silent cabin. But life had irreversibly changed since the day he found a dying wolf in the snow. At last, the confrontation arrived. From the darkness, shapes materialized. Two men clad in heavy winter gear, silhouettes stark against moonlit drifts. They moved with purpose, clearly no longer concerned with stealth. As they neared the cabin, Rowan's fatherly neighbor, who'd been standing watch outside, shouted a warning. The men ignored it. One raised a gun in response, muzzle flashing as a shot tore through the stillness. Chaos exploded. The father dove behind a stack of firewood, radioing Sorensen to confirm the men were armed. Sorensen shouted back, "Stand down, police!" but was answered with another wild gunshot cracking through the night. Inside, Lily let out a muffled sob, hugging Rusty tightly, while Mrs. Hawkins, adrenaline coursing, ducked behind a window with her camera rolling. Seeing no choice, Rowan flung open the cabin door, rifle raised but aimed upward to show he meant no direct harm unless forced. His voice carried over the raging wind. "Leave now! We have proof of your traps, and law enforcement is on the way." The intruders paused, one barking a crude command Rowan couldn't fully decipher. Then a second shot whizzed past, splintering the porch railing. Rowan's breath caught in terror. Suddenly, a flash of movement, a figure behind the attackers. Sorensen's backup rangers, having flanked around the cabin, ordered them to drop their weapons. One suspect whirled in panic, firing blindly. A ranger cried out in alarm. In the heartbeats that followed, everything seemed to slow. Mrs. Hawkins captured the moment as Lily's father, ignoring personal risk, tackled one of the men, knocking the gun from his grasp. The other suspect stumbled, caught between rangers advancing with guns drawn and Rowan's rifle pointed from the cabin's threshold. "Don't make this worse," Sorensen bellowed, voice echoing through the swirling snow. With tense, furious expressions, the men raised their hands, the glint of their firearms hitting the ground. Relief washed through Rowan, limbs trembling. He lowered his rifle, breath ragged. "Ms." Hawkins emerged, filming the rangers swarming to cuff the suspects. Beside her, Lily's mother erupted in a sob of relief. Inside the cabin, Lily remained crouched by Rusty. The wolf's ears twitched at the noise of the scuffle, but something in Lily's soothing whispers calmed him. When the final cry of "clear" sounded outside, Lily dared to rise, creeping to the doorway. Her father stood in the moonlit yard, face pale but proud, the rangers leading the captured men away. A swirl of police lights approached from the distance, painting the snow in pulses of red and blue. For a moment, Rowan and Lily locked eyes across the threshold, both awestruck and exhausted by the confrontation's intensity. The dog rested at Lily's side, panting softly, as though exhaling the dread that had haunted their every breath. Rowan stepped aside to let Sorensen pass with the suspects, who now glared at the family with seething hatred. Yet, the father and mother, Lily, Ms. Hawkins and Rowan all stood in defiant unity. They had protected Rusty, and in doing so struck a blow against a savage trade that had plagued their forest. The tension that had built to a shattering crescendo finally ebbed under the swirling lights of approaching law enforcement. Shadows of rangers and captured criminals danced across the snow, marking the end of a harrowing standoff, and setting the stage for the miracle Lily had long believed in. Now, as the night surrendered to dawn, the final resolution loomed. How would the wolf story continue in a world that had both harmed and saved it? The hardest decisions about Rusty's fate and the bond that had united all involved still lay ahead. Grey fingers of dawn stretched over the horizon, illuminating the aftermath of the night's events. The men who had terrorized Rowan's small circle lay in custody, their grim faces still etched with resentment. Ranger Sorensen and his team stood by their vehicles, checking weapons and exchanging terse updates over radios. Stunned but relieved, Rowan and Lily's father lingered near the cabin's porch, watching as the final official statements were taken. Through the thinning mist, Lily could see Ms. Hawkins speaking quietly with an officer, her camera hanging from her neck like an afterthought. The tension that had gripped them for days finally began to ease, and an inexplicable calm settled on the snow-laden clearing. Inside the cabin, Lily knelt beside Rusty, the rescued wolf. Though anxious throughout the confrontation, the animal had remained relatively composed, an unexpected reaction that left Lily's mother in awe. "He could have panicked, tried to flee or attack, but he didn't," she murmured, stroking the wolf's thickening coat. Dr. Braxton, summoned to check on the wolf's condition post-ordeal, gave a soft smile of relief. "It's rare to see a wild animal adapt like this, even temporarily. He must sense the bond here is stronger than fear." As bright morning light flooded through the frosted windows, Rowan joined them, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. He looked down at the wolf, feeling a surge of gratitude and admiration. "I found you half frozen in a snare," he said quietly, recalling every detail of that fateful day. "And now we've come so far. But is it time for you to go free, or is there another path for you here?" His question, spoken more to himself than anyone else, hovered in the cabin's warm air. A short while later, Sorensen entered, cheeks flushed from the cold. "We've secured the suspects, and they're being transported," he informed them. "We found evidence, guns, snares, and even some tracking documents that suggest they were part of a bigger operation. It's not over, but this is a major blow to that ring." Lily's mother exhaled in visible relief, tears brimming. "So the threat is gone?" she asked. Sorensen shook his head. "Hardly gone, but at least contained for now. We'll keep patrolling. The evidence, Ms. Hawkins collected, plus your testimonies, should help prosecute them to the fullest." Lily, pressing her cheek against Rusty's flank, gazed up at her parents. "He's safe, right?" she spoke in a trembling whisper. Her father crouched beside her, running a hand through her hair. "Safe from them, yes, but we still have to decide how best to care for him now." Dr. Braxton cleared her throat. "The wolf's leg is healing well, but it won't be the same. He can't just be dumped in the wild and left to fend for himself, not immediately anyway. He'll need continued therapy, time to strengthen his muscles, and careful reintroduction if that's the goal. On the other hand, if you plan to keep him domestically, that raises ethical issues. He's a wild animal, not a typical pet." A hushed debate commenced among the cluster of people who had seen this journey through. Lily, tears shining in her eyes, argued passionately for finding a sanctuary, some place that respected his wild instincts yet protected him from lingering threats. Mrs. Hawkins agreed, suggesting she could use her network of wildlife organizations to locate a reputable refuge. Sorensen affirmed that a specialized facility might be the best option, one that could handle partial rehabilitation or long-term stewardship of a wolf unable to thrive in the wild. Rowan, though torn, gazed at Rusty with a mixture of affection and sorrow. "If he's got a chance at a real life out there, I want him to have it. But I won't let him wander back into snare-filled woods either. Her sanctuary could be the answer." The wolf, lifting its head at Rowan's voice, blinked with calm acceptance, as though comprehending the weight of the man's decision. Over the next hour, calls were placed. Ms. Hawkins reached out to a well-regarded wolf sanctuary in a neighboring state, an expansive reserve dedicated to rehabilitating and safeguarding canids who couldn't fully return to the wild. By remarkable fortune, they had an available enclosure and staff experienced in transitional care for injured wolves. "They can take him," Ms. Hawkins said, breathless with excitement. "We'll need to arrange transport, but it's feasible." As the day wore on, Lily found it both a joyous prospect and a heartbreaking farewell. Crouched by Rusty's side, she stroked his ears, eyes misting over. "You'll be with your own kind," she whispered, voice shaking. "No more traps, no more fear. Promise me you'll be happy." The wolf licked her hand gently, a moment of tender acknowledgement that left everyone watching in quiet awe. Finally, evening arrived. A specialized transport vehicle from the sanctuary rolled up, driven by two calm-eyed caretakers who carefully assessed the wolf's condition. With Dr. Braxton's guidance, they prepared a secure, padded crate for the journey. Lily's mother wrapped an old blanket around the wolf, one that carried the cabin's comforting scent. Rowan helped lift him inside, murmuring soft reassurances. The wolf, though anxious, allowed himself to be guided, trusting in the silent bond he shared with his rescuers. When the moment came to close the crate door, Lily burst into tears, pressing a final kiss to the wolf's muzzle. Lily's father placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, pride and sorrow mingling in his expression. "You saved him," he said gently. "You, maybe all of us, made a difference." Miss Hawkins filmed the scene, her eyes brimming as well, knowing it was the culmination of a story that had begun with cruelty in a frozen trap and ended with hope on a winter evening. The truck's engine rumbled to life, and as it pulled away, the group stood in the swirling snow, watching the taillights fade into the distance. The hush that enveloped them then was profound, echoing with both loss and triumph. Rowan exhaled, tears warming his face against the biting cold. He felt Lily's small hand slip into his, and he squeezed it softly. "You were right all along," he whispered. He deserved a miracle. Thus, the final chords of the confrontation gave way to a quiet resolution. The wolf, once ensnared and nearly frozen to death, would find sanctuary in a place equipped to restore his dignity. The poachers, though one ring might still remain at large, had been dealt a crippling blow by the evidence gathered. And each person involved, Rowan, Lily, her parents, Mrs. Hawkins, Dr. Braxton, and Ranger Sorensen, emerged forever changed by a single act of compassion. In the hush of that winter's twilight, they discovered that bravery, kindness, and fierce resolve could indeed spark miracles in even the harshest landscapes. In the hush that followed the wolf's departure to the sanctuary, life in Rowan's cabin felt both quieter and strangely emptier. Gone was the wounded creature that had for so many weeks been the focal point of worry, empathy, and unwavering courage. Now the blankets near the fireplace lay unused, the supply of medical bandages untouched, and the corner where the wolf once rested seemed haunted by a peaceful absence. Yet beneath this sudden calm, each person touched by the ordeal discovered a resonance that would echo far beyond the cabin walls. Lily, whose compassionate spark had been instrumental in the wolf's recovery, was the first to confront the hollow sense of goodbye. Over the next few days, she couldn't help but visit Rowan's cabin, as though expecting to see the wolf's keen eyes peering at her from behind the partition. She'd wander through the yard, recalling how the animal had cautiously explored those drifts of snow, limping on its bandaged leg. Though sadness gnawed at her, Lily also carried a glimmer of pride. "He's safe now," she reminded herself whenever tears threatened. "He'll run free with others of his kind. We gave him that chance." Rowan too felt an odd pang of loss. Each morning, he'd awaken to a space devoid of the wolf's soft whines or rustling movements. Yet as he gazed upon the winter-bleached forest through his cabin's window, he recalled the day he first found the animal, emaciated, ensnared, and close to surrender. In that life-altering moment, he had stepped out of his solitary comfort, risking everything to save a desperate soul. Now, reflecting on the journey, Rowan understood that the rescue had changed him just as much as it had changed the wolf. The lonely trapper had become a protector, an advocate for a fragile world, and in forging that connection, he found a renewed sense of purpose. Meanwhile, the local authorities' crackdown on illegal snaring intensified, bolstered by evidence from the stakeout and Ms. Hawkins footage. A series of arrests followed, dismantling key parts of the ring that had plagued the region's wildlife. Ranger Sorensen, though still wary of further retaliation, met Rowan with a rare smile one afternoon. "We've done real damage to their operation," he said, voice brimming with relief. "And your bravery, or, well, stubbornness, helped make it happen. The forest owes you a debt." Rowan, modest as ever, just shook his head. "The wolf deserves the credit. He survived long enough to let us step in." Ms. Hawkins, in turn, crafted a final comprehensive feature on the entire saga. Her article, titled "A Wolf's Second Chance: Compassion and Courage in the Winter Wilderness," soared to widespread acclaim, prompting calls for stronger wildlife protections. She detailed how a single act of empathy, Rowan prying open that wire snare, had unraveled a tapestry of cruelty. But more importantly, she highlighted how a community rose against adversity, unified by the shared conviction that no life, whether human or animal, should be left to suffer unseen. The article spurred donations to local rescue programs and roused new volunteers for Ranger Sorensen's patrols, hinting that something akin to a movement had ignited. Even Lily's father, once skeptical about endangering the family's safety, found his perspective softened by the outcome. One brisk weekend, he arrived at the cabin with an offering of supplies: wood for the fire, fresh produce, and basic medications, silently acknowledging the role Rowan continued to play in safeguarding their slice of wilderness. Though his eyes still revealed a parent's abiding concern, his tone carried respect. "You did good, Rowan," he said simply, as they stacked firewood side by side. "We may not see eye to eye on everything, but we protected what mattered." As for Rusty, the name Lily had bestowed on the wolf, he adapted to the sanctuary more smoothly than Dr. Braxton dared hope. Occasional updates trickled in through Ms. Hawkins, who remained in contact with the facility. The wolf's leg continued healing under professional wildlife handlers, while his spirit, once weighed down by trauma, began to rekindle in the company of other rescued canids. Photographs showed him sniffing at penned enclosures, forging tentative friendships with a younger wolf, and even learning to howl again under the safety of the sanctuary's watchful eyes. Each snippet of news left Lily beaming, and Rowan smiling softly at the cabin's hearth, a warmth flooding him that even the fiercest winter storm couldn't quell. As life returned to a calmer rhythm, the memory of that final confrontation, gunshots ringing through the icy forest, the swirl of police lights, did not vanish. Rather, it served as a collective reminder of how fragile safety could be and how crucial it was to stand against cruelty. The revelations of widespread poaching brought fresh legislation proposals, ensuring stiffer penalties for illegal trapping. Town hall meetings saw record attendance, with everyday citizens emboldened to speak up about preserving their environment. The wolf's rescue had rippled outward, catalyzing a shift in the community's conscience. If Rowan's story and the wolf's near-death survival stirred your heart, join us in championing the life and dignity of animals everywhere. Subscribe to our channel for more uplifting stories of compassion. Like and share this video to spread awareness, and leave a comment describing your own experiences or hopes for protecting wildlife. Together, we can become guardians of the voiceless, transforming empathy into action that spans every corner of the wilderness. Let this wolf's miraculous second chance be a beacon, reminding us that when we reach across boundaries, between species, between communities, we can conjure miracles that defy the cruelest traps set by a sometimes indifferent world. With the final echoes of winter fading and the forest slowly awakening to the promise of spring, Rowan felt a profound sense of hope. Though the path that started with one wolf's desperate plight had led them all through darkness, it culminated in renewed unity and maybe, just maybe, a better future for every living soul sharing the same cold wind and bright sky. And so, as he stoked the cabin's fire one last time, he whispered a silent wish across the snowy landscape, that Rusty, healed and free, would howl beneath a moonlit sky in gratitude, an echo of the compassion that saved him and enriched countless lives along the way.